There's something nobody prepares you for when your child looks at you like you're furniture. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just that flat, dismissive look. The kind you give a chair that's been in the way too long. I saw that look on my son's face the morning he told me he'd spoken to a financial advisor about restructuring the estate. He was 34 years old. He had a law degree from Georgetown and a LinkedIn profile that listed 6 different certifications. And he looked at me, 61 years old, standing in the kitchen of the house I'd bought before he was born, like I was a problem he'd finally figured out how to solve. I didn't say anything right away. I poured my coffee. I looked out the window at the backyard where I'd built a wooden deck the summer he was 7, where his mother and I had watched him catch fireflies in a mason jar until she got tired, and I stayed out alone just watching him run. I thought about that for a moment. Then I asked if he wanted breakfast. He said he didn't have time. That was the beginning. Or maybe it wasn't the beginning. Maybe it was just the first morning I let myself see what had already been there for a while. My name is Bernard. I spent 38 years working for a regional engineering firm in western Pennsylvania, the kind of company that doesn't make headlines but keeps bridges standing and water treatment plants running. I started as a draftsman. I retired as a senior project engineer, with my name on 11 infrastructure contracts across 4 states. I never went to Georgetown. I went to a state school on a partial scholarship and paid off my student loans by working weekends at a hardware store for 3 years after graduation. My wife, Caroline, taught 4th grade for 26 years. We were not wealthy, we were careful. When Caroline passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, I made 2 decisions. The first was that I would not sell the house. The second was that I would take everything we had saved over 30 years and do something quiet and deliberate with it, something she would have approved of. My son, whose name is Travis, had always assumed the first decision was sentiment. He was not wrong, but he also assumed the second decision hadn't happened yet. He was wrong about that. Travis moved back home 3 years after Caroline died. He'd been in D.C., working at a mid-sized law firm, living with a girlfriend named Angela, who I liked very much, and who he left for reasons he never fully explained to me. When he came back, I told him he was welcome, as long as he needed. I meant it. I cleared out the guest room, put fresh sheets on the bed, bought the brand of coffee he liked. I was glad to have someone in the house. Grief does something to silence. It makes it louder than it should be. The first year was fine. He was job searching, which I understood. Legal work in Pittsburgh takes time to find if you're coming from D.C. with a specialty in corporate mergers and not many local connections. I didn't charge him rent. I cooked dinner most nights. We watched football on Sundays the way we used to when he was in high school, before everything got complicated. The second year was when I noticed the shift. It was small things at first. He stopped asking about my day. He started taking phone calls in the other room and lowering his voice in a way that felt deliberate. He brought home a woman named Courtney, who was pleasant enough to my face, but who once, when she didn't know I was in the hallway, referred to me as your dad's situation. I didn't know what that meant. I still don't exactly, but I know how it made me feel. He got a job at a corporate firm downtown. Good salary, from what I could tell. New car, new suits, a watch I didn't recognize and didn't ask about. I was happy for him. I told him so. He thanked me with the kind of efficiency you use when someone compliments your parking job. And then, about 6 months after he started the new job, he sat me down in the living room and told me he'd been thinking about my financial situation. He said he was worried about me, said the house was too big for one person, that maintenance costs were going up, that the neighborhood had changed, and property values were strong right now, and I should seriously consider liquidating before the market shifted. He had a folder. Printed graphs, a comparison of assisted living facilities in the county. I was 61 years old. I coached youth baseball until last spring. I had walked 4 miles that morning. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I said, I appreciate you thinking about it. I'm not ready to make any changes. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and had already planned around it. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. Not what he said, but how unsurprised he looked. After that conversation, things moved faster than I expected. He started having people over without telling me. Not parties, just Courtney, and sometimes 2 or 3 colleagues I'd never met who would sit at my kitchen table, talking about things I wasn't invited into. He replaced the coffee maker without asking. It was a better coffee maker, but he didn't ask. He moved 2 of Caroline's framed watercolors from the hallway to the garage because, he said, they made the space feel dated. I put them back. He moved them again. I didn't find them until I was looking for a box of holiday lights in November. There was a conversation in March that I think about often. He came home late, loosened his tie in the doorway the way he does when he's feeling superior about something, and told me that he'd been talking to an estate attorney. Just preliminary conversations, he said, getting a sense of things. I asked him what things. He said the house mostly, and whatever else you've got set aside. It makes sense to start planning now, before things get complicated. Before things get complicated. Before things get complicated. I was 61. His mother had died at 58. I understood what he was really saying. I've already done my planning, I told him. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has just told you they've already packed the car when you haven't seen them touch a suitcase. Skeptical. A little impatient. Dad, he said, and the way he said it had about 40 years of condescension folded into 2 letters. You drew up a basic will 15 years ago. Things have changed. The house alone is worth. I know what it's worth, I said. He stopped. Smiled in a way that didn't reach anything behind it. Okay, he said. We'll talk about it when you're ready. I had been ready for quite some time. He just didn't know what I'd been ready for. Here is what Travis didn't know. 4 years before that conversation, 2 years after Caroline died, I had spent 14 months working with a financial planner named Judith and an estate attorney named Richard who had been practicing in Allegheny County for 30 years. I had restructured everything: the house, the retirement accounts, a savings portfolio I had been building steadily since 1987, and that by then had reached a value that would have surprised my son considerably. Judith had asked me early in the process what I wanted my money to do. I told her I wanted 2 things. First, I wanted to make sure that whatever I left behind reflected what I actually valued, not just who happened to share my last name. Second, I wanted there to be no question, legally or otherwise, that the decisions were mine, made clearly, documented thoroughly, witnessed by people who had known me for decades. She asked if there was a specific concern. I said, not yet, but I've watched enough of my friends go through this to know that the concern tends to arrive on its own schedule. She nodded. She understood. What we created was not complicated. It was simply complete. The house was placed in a revocable living trust with terms that were specific about conditions. My financial accounts were reorganized. There were 2 letters sealed with Richard's firm, one to be opened in the event of my death, one to be opened under a separate set of circumstances that Richard and I had discussed at length. I signed everything on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Then I went home and made chili for dinner and watched the Pirates lose, which they are talented at, and I didn't say a word about any of it to anyone. That was the second decision. The one Caroline would have approved of. The situation with Travis came to a head in early June, about 3 months after the conversation about the estate attorney. He and Courtney had been spending nearly every weekend at the house. I had started to feel, in a way I hadn't felt since I was a new hire at 24, like a guest somewhere I lived. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs to find Courtney in my kitchen making a shopping list, and Travis on the back deck on a video call with someone I didn't recognize, walking that person through the layout of the yard. I stood in the doorway for a moment. He saw me. He didn't pause the call. I went back upstairs. That afternoon, I called my older brother, Gene. Wait, no. I called my friend of 40 years, A man named Clifton who had worked with me at the firm for 22 years and who had seen me through Caroline's illness and the year after, and every difficult thing in between. Clifton is not a man who says much, but he says what he means. I told him what was happening. There was a long pause on his end. "What are you waiting for?" he said. I told him I wasn't sure. Maybe I was still hoping something would shift. Maybe I was waiting for the version of my son I recognized to come back through the door. Clifton said, "Bernard, he is showing you who he is. The question is whether you're going to let him show you twice." I thought about that for the rest of the day. The following Tuesday, Travis sat me down again. This time he had a document. Not a graph. An actual legal document printed, with a cover sheet from a law office I didn't recognize. He set it on the coffee table in front of me and said that he'd had an attorney review the estate and that there were significant inefficiencies in how things were structured. He wanted me to sign something that would transfer the house into a joint tenancy arrangement with right of survivorship, with him as the co-owner. He explained it calmly. He used words like streamline and protect and simplify the transition. He said it would be better for both of us. I picked up the document. I read the first 2 pages. Then I set it back down on the table. "Who is this firm?" I asked. He named them. I didn't recognize them. "Did you talk to my attorney?" I asked. He said he hadn't needed to. I looked at him for a moment. He was wearing the watch again. He had Courtney's coffee mug on the end table next to him. The ceramic one with her initials on it that had appeared in my cabinet about 6 weeks ago. He looked comfortable. Settled. Like a man who had already decided how a meeting was going to end. "Travis," I said, "how long have you been planning this?" He said it wasn't planning, it was just practicality. He said I was getting older, I was 61, and that it was responsible to get ahead of things. He said he was trying to help. I put the document back on the coffee table. "I need to make a phone call," I said. I called Richard. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what was on the table. He asked me a few questions. Then he said what I already knew. That signing anything like that without review was something I should absolutely not do, and that if my son was presenting legal documents to me without coordinating with my existing attorney, that was something Richard wanted to know about in writing. I thanked him. I went back to the living room. Travis was still there, which surprised me a little. He'd expected this to be quick. I told him I would not be signing anything. He said, "Dad." I said, "I've spoken to my attorney. If you'd like to have a conversation about the estate, it goes through Richard's office. That's how it works." Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly. More like the specific frustration of a person who has just realized the game board was different from what they thought. He said Richard was a general practice attorney, and that this was more complex than what someone like that typically handles. I said Richard had been handling my affairs for 11 years and had my complete confidence. He said, "You don't really understand what you have and what it could become if it was managed properly." I let that sit for a moment. 38 years of infrastructure engineering, 11 contracts, a savings portfolio I had built, dollar by careful dollar, while he was getting his Georgetown degree on a fund I had contributed to every month for 17 years. I let all of that sit there quietly between us. Then I said, "I understand it fine." He left the room. He went upstairs. I heard him on the phone with someone for about 40 minutes. Then he came back down, picked up his document from the coffee table, and told me he needed some time to think. He went to Courtney's apartment that night, and the next night, and most nights after that for the next 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I did 3 things. I called Richard and told him to proceed with implementing the second letter, the one for the separate set of circumstances. He said he'd have everything ready within the week. I called my nephew Donovan, who was 38, and who had been Caroline's sister's boy and who had spent more time at our kitchen table growing up than in his own home. Donovan had become an electrician, then a contractor, and now ran his own construction company in Columbus. He was one of the steadiest people I knew. I told him I wanted to talk. He drove up that Saturday. We sat on the back deck, the one I'd built when Travis was 7, and I told him everything. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "Uncle Bernard, what do you need from me?" I told him. He nodded slowly. "Whatever you need," he said. "You know that." The third thing I did was quiet. I packed a bag. Not everything, just what I'd need for a month or two, and I called my old friend Clifton, who had a guest room and had offered it more times than I could count. I told him I'd be taking him up on it. Then I left a single envelope on the kitchen table. Inside the envelope was a letter and a key. Not the house key, but a small brass key to the fireproof box I kept in the hall closet. The box that held the documents I'd been quietly building for 4 years. The letter had 3 sentences. The key opens the box in the hall closet. Inside is a copy of the trust document and a contact number for Richard. I'd suggest reading everything before you make any more phone calls. I closed the front door behind me. I didn't slam it. I had no need to. I heard from Richard 5 days later. Apparently Travis had found the envelope. He had opened the box. And what he found inside had required, according to Richard, approximately 45 minutes of very quiet reading, followed by a phone call to Richard's office in which Travis said very little, and Richard said quite a bit. The trust document was 43 pages. It was specific. The house was in the trust. The financial accounts were in the trust. The terms of distribution were tied not to my death, but to a set of conditions. Conditions that Richard and I had written carefully, and that a judge would have had very little trouble upholding. The conditions were not punitive. They were simply honest. They described the kind of relationship that would make inheritance meaningful, and they described what happened in the absence of that relationship. Travis was not disinherited. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I am not a man who believes in cruelty dressed up as justice. He was still named. But what he'd been planning to receive, what he'd been maneuvering toward for the better part of 2 years, was conditional, in ways he had not accounted for. There was also a second named beneficiary, Donovan. Not everything, not even close to half, but a meaningful amount tied to a set of conditions that Donovan had already been meeting for years without knowing there was anything to meet. Being present, being honest, treating people the way Caroline would have recognized. Richard told me Travis had asked one question at the end of the call. He'd asked, "How long has this been in place?" Richard told him, 4 years. There was a long silence, apparently. Then Travis said he needed to speak with me. We met at a diner near Clifton's house, about 2 weeks after I'd left the envelope. Travis drove 40 minutes to get there. He arrived before I did, which surprised me. He was sitting in a corner booth with his hands around a coffee cup, and when I came through the door and he looked up, he looked different, not defeated. Just smaller than he usually seemed, like some of the extra he'd been carrying around had been set down somewhere. I sat across from him. The waitress came. I ordered eggs and toast. He said he was fine with just coffee. We were quiet for a moment. He said, "I didn't know about Donovan." I said, "No." He said, "I didn't know it had been set up that long ago." I said, "No, you didn't." He was quiet again. Outside the window, a woman was pushing a stroller past a dry cleaner, and the whole ordinary world was just going about its business, while we sat there in the corner of that diner, trying to figure out what was left between us. He said, I thought you didn't know what you were doing. Financially, I thought you needed help." I told him that I had never needed help managing what I had built. What I had needed at various points in my life was company and help with the deck, and someone to sit with on the night Caroline came home from the hospital for the last time. But not financial guidance. Not from him. He was quiet a long time. Then he said something that I did not expect. He said, "I'm sorry." Not for the document, not for the estate conversations, not for the specific maneuvering he'd been doing. He said, "I'm sorry for how I've been treating you. For a long time." I looked at him. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't checking the door. He was looking directly at me in a way I hadn't seen him look at me in years. I said, "Why?" He thought about it. He said, I think after Mom died, I started seeing you differently, like you were the part of the picture that was left, and the picture wasn't the one I wanted anymore." That's not a good reason. That's not even a reason. But I think that's what happened. I didn't say anything for a while. The eggs came. I ate some of them. "Find me," I said. "Your mother would have been furious with you." He almost smiled. It was the most genuine expression I'd seen on his face in 2 years. "I know," he said. She would have said something quietly and then given me the look, and I would have felt terrible for a week. "At least a week," I said. We sat there for another hour. We didn't resolve everything. You don't undo 2 years in a diner booth over bad coffee. But we talked. He talked more than he usually does. He told me that Courtney had asked him why he'd never taken me out to dinner or called me just to check in, and he hadn't had an answer for her that he was proud of. He said that had been sitting with him. I told him that the trust was not going to change unless circumstances did. I told him that Donovan was good people and deserved what I'd set aside, and that Travis being named was not a punishment or a reward, but simply the truth of how I felt, laid out on 43 pages, so there was no room for guessing. He said he understood. He said, "I don't want to fight you for the house, Dad." I said, "I know, but now you also know you can't." He almost smiled again. I went back to the house 3 weeks later. I put Caroline's watercolors back in the hallway. Travis moved out by the end of the month. He got an apartment about 12 minutes away, which he'd been able to do for quite some time had he chosen to. He calls me on Sundays now. Not every Sunday, but most of them. Courtney asked if she could have me over for dinner last month. She cooked a pot roast that was better than I expected. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She was, I thought, genuinely trying. I appreciated that. Donovan doesn't know the full details yet. He will when the time is right. I expect he'll be embarrassed, and then he'll argue with me about it, and then I'll tell him that Caroline picked him out of the whole family as the one who showed up the most consistently. And that was worth something. He won't have much to say to that. I had dinner with Richard last fall, just the two of us at a steakhouse downtown. He told me that in 30 years of estate work, he'd seen dozens of situations like mine go wrong, in ways that took years, and lawyers in courtrooms to untangle. He said mine was the first time he'd watched someone set the whole thing up so quietly, in advance, and then simply walk out the front door and wait. I told him that patience was the one skill nobody teaches you and everybody eventually needs. He raised his glass. We drank to that. It is a framed photograph on the mantel in my living room. Caroline and me at our 25th anniversary dinner, the year before she got sick. She's laughing at something. I don't even remember what. I'm looking at her. We were both just exactly where we were supposed to be. I look at it some mornings when the house is quiet. I think about what she would say about all of it. Travis, the trust, the diner, the pot roast. I think she would say I handled it right. I think she would say I waited longer than I needed to, but that the ending was okay. I think she would say, "You didn't burn anything down. You just showed him where the walls were. That's enough for me." I've had a lot of years to think about what went wrong between Travis and me, and I keep landing on the same place. It wasn't the money. It was never really the money. It was the moment he decided that what I'd built with my hands and my years in Caroline's patience didn't count as real, because it didn't come with a title or a degree or a firm downtown. That's a particular kind of blindness. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because I think it matters to name it clearly. When you spend your life doing unglamorous work well, showing up, being steady, making the kind of decisions that don't make headlines but keep a family standing. And the person closest to you looks right through it. That's not just painful. It's a kind of information. It tells you what they've been taught to value. And sometimes what they've been taught is just wrong. What I did, the trust, the letters, the years of quiet planning, wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was the opposite of revenge. Revenge is reactive. It's emotional. It burns things down because burning feels like power. What I did was patient. It was built on the belief that honesty, laid out carefully and completely, is the most durable thing you can leave behind. Not anger, not punishment, just the truth, written down, witnessed, and sealed until the moment it needed to matter. The cause and the effect here are simple, even if they took years to play out. Travis treated me like someone who didn't know what he was doing. He made decisions based on that assumption, and every single one of those decisions ran directly into a wall I had built 4 years before he started pushing. That's not luck. That's what happens when a person spends decades paying attention. When you've worked long enough in engineering, you understand that the things that hold up under pressure aren't the ones that look impressive. They're the ones that were built right, quietly, without cutting corners. I think about Donovan a lot. He never asked for anything. He just kept showing up. Drove 4 hours on a Saturday because his uncle called and said he needed to talk. That kind of loyalty doesn't announce itself. It doesn't put itself on a resume. But it's the thing, the real thing, that a life is made of. Clifton said it best, in his way. He said, "Bernard, he is showing you who he is." The question was always whether I was going to let that information sit there or do something honest with it. I chose honest. I chose it slowly, carefully, and with Richard's help on 43 pages of clean legal language. And I think that choice, not the money, not the house, not any of it, is what eventually reached Travis in that diner booth. Not the documents. The fact that I'd been paying attention to what mattered long before he started paying attention at all. The watercolors are back on the wall. The deck is still standing. On Sunday mornings when the phone rings, I pick it up. That's enough.